The moment you take a person's dignity, you don't just chain their body, you silence who they are. The sound came first. Metal dragging across dry Texas dirt. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just steady. Repeating. 8 pairs of feet stepped down from the back of a military truck under a sky so wide it felt indifferent to everything below it. The heat pressed down like a weight, heavy and unmoving, the kind that made the air itself feel thick. Dust rose with every step, clinging to boots, to fabric, to skin that had already seen too much of the world. Elise Hartmann stepped last. 27 years old. A nurse once. Someone who had held hands instead of carrying anything that bound. Her foot touched the ground, and the chain followed a second later, scraping, pulling her stride shorter than it should have been. She adjusted without thinking. Not because she accepted it, but because her body had already learned what survival demanded. Around her, the others moved the same way. Careful. Measured. Quiet. No one spoke. Not because they were told not to. Because there was nothing left to say that would change where they were. A guard checked a clipboard. Another glanced at his watch. Routine. Procedure. Words that turn people into tasks. The sun climbed higher, bleaching color out of everything until the world looked almost faded. Elise kept her eyes forward. Not defiant. Not submissive. Just, steady. As if looking anywhere else would mean giving something away she couldn't afford to lose. 50 yards away, a man stood by a fence line. Hat low. Shoulders squared from years of work that had nothing to do with war. Jack Callahan didn't move at first. He had seen prisoners before. Men mostly. This wasn't new. But something about the rhythm of those chains against the ground caught him. Not the sound itself. What it meant. He watched as one of the women shifted her weight and nearly lost her balance. The chain pulled her back before she could take a full step. She didn't fall. She corrected. Continued. Like it didn't matter. Like it had never mattered. Jack's jaw tightened, though no one would have noticed. The officer near the truck spoke briefly. Instructions. Assignments. Words carried by heat and distance but stripped of meaning before they reached anyone who needed them. Elise felt the dust settle on her skin, mixing with sweat, with memory, with something quieter she refused to name. She focused on the next step. Then the next. The chain dragged. Again. And again. Each movement smaller than it should have been. Each second longer. Jack finally moved. Not fast. Not with urgency. Just a decision made visible. His boots pressed into the same dirt, but they didn't make the same sound. He stopped 10 feet away from the line of women. Close enough now to see the details others ignored. The marks at the ankle. The way her shoulders held themselves, not broken, not bowed, just controlled. He looked at Elise, and for a brief moment, she met his eyes. No words passed. None were needed. There was something there. Not recognition. Not understanding. Just the quiet acknowledgement that she was still someone. Not something. The chain shifted again. Metal on dirt. And in that sound, something changed. The officer's voice cut through the heat, flat and practiced, listing instructions that landed on the ground like everything else, without weight, without consequence, as if the words themselves had been used too many times to mean anything anymore. Names were not called. Only numbers, assignments, directions. The women were told where to stand, where to move, how far to walk, each command measured in feet and seconds, each one designed to keep things orderly, predictable, controlled. Elise listened, but not to understand. She had learned that understanding was optional. Compliance was not. The chain shifted again as she adjusted her footing, the metal catching the light for a brief second before disappearing back into dust. Beside her, one of the younger women hesitated, just for a fraction of a moment, her balance uncertain under the restriction. No one reached for her. No one needed to. She corrected herself, just like the others. Quiet. Efficient. Invisible. Jack stood still, close enough now to hear the rhythm of their breathing, uneven but steady, the kind that came from holding something in rather than letting it out. He glanced at the officer, then back at the line. Procedure. He knew the word. He had lived by it in different forms his entire life. Fix the fence this way. Break the horse that way. Follow the steps and you get the result. But this was different. There was no work being done here. No task being completed. Just a condition being maintained. He shifted his weight, boots pressing deeper into the dirt, and for a moment, he did nothing. Not because he agreed. Because he was deciding. Elise felt the sun on the back of her neck, sharp now, the kind that would burn if you stayed still too long. She kept her shoulders level, her gaze forward, but her awareness shifted slightly toward the man who had stepped closer. Not fear. Not expectation. Just recognition that something in the space had changed. It was subtle. Almost nothing. But it was there. The officer finished speaking and turned slightly, ready to move on, to continue the routine, to let the system carry itself forward without interruption. That was how it worked. That was how it always worked. Jack took one step forward. Then another. Not fast. Not aggressive. Just enough to enter the space where decisions were usually not questioned. The officer noticed him now, a brief pause, a flicker of irritation crossing his face before settling back into neutrality. This is a restricted area, he said, the words automatic, delivered without looking directly at Jack for more than a second. Jack did not answer immediately. He looked past the officer, back at the line, back at Elise, at the chain that shortened every step she took. The metal links were simple. Functional. Easy to unlock. He knew that without needing to be told. His eyes moved once more, taking in the scene the way a man measures land before deciding where to build. Nothing about it was complicated. That was the problem. He let out a slow breath, not loud enough to draw attention, but enough to settle something inside him into place. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying just far enough to be heard without forcing itself into the air. That is not necessary. The officer turned fully now, a slight edge in his posture. It is protocol, he replied, the word landing harder this time, as if repetition could give it authority. Jack nodded once, as if acknowledging the statement, but his eyes did not move. Maybe, he said. A pause followed. Not long. Just enough to separate what had been from what was about to be. Then he took another step closer. The space held for a moment, stretched thin between what was expected and what was about to change, the kind of silence that does not feel empty but waiting, as if even the heat had paused to see what would happen next. The officer studied Jack now, more carefully, measuring him the same way he had measured everything else that morning, by rank, by authority, by whether he could be dismissed. Jack did not look like a man asking for permission. He looked like a man who had already decided. Elise felt it before she understood it, a shift not in the air but in the way the people around her carried themselves, subtle, almost invisible, but real. The chain at her ankle pulled again as she adjusted her stance, the metal pressing against skin that had long stopped reacting. She did not look down. She had learned not to. But she felt it, the weight, the restriction, the quiet reminder that every step she took was being measured for her. Jack took one more step forward until he stood within arm's reach of the nearest woman. Close enough now that the details were no longer distant impressions but facts. The dust on their shoes. The dryness of their hands. The way their posture held something back that no order could fully remove. He glanced once more at the officer, giving him the chance to say something that might change what came next. The officer did not. Not because he agreed, but because he was no longer certain. That was enough. Jack lowered himself slowly, not in a gesture of submission but of intention, one knee bending toward the ground, his movement steady, unhurried, as if this was simply another task that needed doing. The women did not move. They did not step back. They did not speak. They watched without appearing to watch, the way people do when they are not sure if what they are seeing is real or temporary. Elise felt the shift again, closer now. Directed, and for the first time since stepping off the truck, her focus broke from the horizon and settled on something in front of her. Jack's hands moved toward the chain. Not abruptly. Not forcefully. Just enough to reach the metal where it met itself in a simple lock. He turned it slightly, examining it the way a man examines a tool, not as something symbolic, not as something political, but as something practical that either served a purpose or did not. His fingers found the mechanism. Simple. Functional. Designed to hold, not to last. The officer took a step forward, hesitation finally catching up with him. "That is not authorized," he said, the words sharper now, but still uncertain, as if even he could hear how thin they sounded in the open air. Jack did not look up. "It is not needed," he replied, his voice even, carrying no anger, no challenge, just a statement placed where it could not be ignored. The key was handed to him without ceremony, passed from a guard who did not fully understand why he was doing it, only that something in the moment made refusal feel heavier than compliance. Jack took it, fitted it into the lock, and paused for half a second, not for effect, but because he understood what came next mattered in a way that could not be undone. Elise stood still, every instinct telling her not to react, not to expect, not to hope. The key turned. A small sound. Precise. Final. The metal loosened. Then fell away. The sound did not echo, but it stayed. Metal against dirt, then silence where weight had been a second before. Elise did not move at first. Not because she could not, but because her body did not immediately understand the absence. For days, for weeks, for however long it had been, every step had been shortened, measured, interrupted. Now there was nothing holding it in place. Her foot shifted slightly, almost testing the ground, almost asking a question she did not dare form. The space around her felt different, though nothing visible had changed. The same sun. The same dust. The same men standing in the same positions. But something had been removed that did not belong there, and the absence of it made everything else sharper. Jack straightened slowly, rising from the ground without brushing the dust from his knee, as if it did not matter, as if what had just happened carried more weight than anything on his clothes. He did not look at the officer. He did not look at the guards. He looked at Elise. Not to check her reaction. Not to expect gratitude. Just to see if she would stand. For a moment, she did not. Then, without announcement, without hesitation, she shifted her weight forward and took a step. A full step. Longer than before. Natural. Unrestricted. It was a small movement. No one would have called it significant if they had not seen what came before. But the difference was there. Clear. Irreversible. The dust moved differently under her foot. The rhythm changed. Around her, the others felt it too. Not as an idea. As a possibility. The officer exhaled quietly, the sound barely noticeable, but enough to reveal that something had slipped beyond his control. He glanced at the remaining chains, then at Jack, then back at the line. The system had not broken. It had been interrupted. And now it had to decide what to do next. Jack did not wait. He stepped toward the next woman, extending his hand without hesitation, the same steady motion, the same lack of ceremony. The guard holding the keys did not need to be told this time. He moved forward, placing them into Jack's hand with less resistance, as if the first act had made the second inevitable. The key turned again. Another lock released. Another chain fell. The sound repeated, each time softer, not because it was quieter, but because it no longer carried the same weight. One by one, the metal gave way. One by one, the women adjusted, shifting their stance, recalibrating their balance, rediscovering movement that had been taken from them but not forgotten. Elise stood still for a moment after her first step, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. She looked down, briefly, at the ground where the chain had been, then back up. Her posture changed, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention, but enough. Enough to be seen by anyone who knew what to look for. Jack finally spoke, his voice quiet, steady, meant for no one and everyone at the same time. You are not animals. The words did not rise. They did not echo. They settled, like the dust, into the space between them. Elise heard them clearly. Not as a command. Not as comfort. As recognition. She did not respond. She did not need to. She took another step. Then another. And this time, nothing held her back. No one gave an order, but the line shifted. Not forward. Not backward. Just enough to acknowledge that something had changed and could not be undone. The guards stood where they were, hands resting near their belts, not tense, not relaxed, caught in that narrow space between instruction and observation. The officer looked at the ground where the chains had fallen, then back at the women, as if trying to reconcile two versions of the same moment that no longer matched. Procedure had not been erased. It had been bypassed. And now it lingered, uncertain, without direction. Elise became aware of her breathing again, slower now, deeper, the kind that filled her lungs instead of stopping halfway. It had been shallow before, though she had not noticed. There had been no reason to. Survival did not require full breaths. Standing did not require balance. But now both had returned, quietly, without announcement. She shifted her shoulders back, not in defiance, not in pride, just in alignment with something that felt closer to who she had been before the war rearranged everything into smaller, tighter versions of itself. The dust on her skin remained. The heat did not change. But the way she occupied the space did. Around her, the others began to move in the same way, small adjustments, almost invisible, but consistent. A hand no longer held too close to the body. A step no longer shortened out of habit. A head that lifted just slightly higher than before. Not enough to draw attention. Enough to be real. Jack stepped back once his hands were empty, returning the key without comment, as if the act itself did not require acknowledgement. He did not wait for approval. He did not look for reaction. He simply moved out of the center of the moment, allowing it to settle on its own terms. That was how things lasted. Not through force, but through quiet permanence. The officer cleared his throat, a small sound that tried to gather what remained of authority into something usable. He looked at his clipboard, then at the line again, adjusting the angle of his stance as if posture alone could restore order. Assignments will proceed, he said, the words firm but less certain than before. The structure remained. The work remained. But something underneath it had shifted, and no instruction could fully cover that. The women began to move, guided by direction rather than restraint, their steps now carrying a rhythm that belonged to them, not to the metal that had dictated it before. Elise walked with the group, her pace steady, measured by distance instead of limitation. 10 yards across the open ground felt different now. Not shorter. Not easier. Just hers. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her that needed confirming. But she felt it, the place where the chain had been, not as absence, but as memory already losing its hold. Jack remained near the fence line, watching for a moment longer, not to monitor, not to judge, just to witness the outcome of something that had not required words to begin with. He adjusted his hat slightly against the sun, the brim casting a shadow across his eyes, and turned back toward the work waiting for him beyond the camp. Fences still needed mending. Horses still needed tending. The world outside continued as it always had. But for a brief moment, something inside the boundary had been corrected. Elise reached the edge of the assigned area and stopped when instructed, her posture steady, her gaze level, her hands at her sides without tension. She listened as new directions were given, her mind registering them clearly, not filtered through fatigue or restraint. Work would begin. It always did. But this time, when she took her position, she did not feel managed. She felt present. And that difference, though no one announced it, stayed. The work began without ceremony, the way most things did in that part of Texas, where the sun dictated pace more than any clock ever could. Rows of fencing stretched across the dry land, weathered wood and wire marking boundaries. That had existed long before the war brought anything unfamiliar into them. Elise stood with the others at the edge of the assigned area, listening as instructions were repeated, slower this time, as if clarity had become more important than control. She understood enough. Fix the posts. Carry the tools. Follow the line. The tasks were simple, grounded, tangible in a way that required no translation. She stepped forward when directed, her boots pressing into the dirt with a weight that now felt evenly distributed, no longer interrupted, no longer shortened. It was a small difference. But it stayed with every step. A man handed her a pair of work gloves, rough leather, worn at the fingertips. He did not meet her eyes for long, just enough to confirm the exchange before looking away, as if unsure what the new rules of this place were. She took them, nodding once, a gesture that felt natural, unforced, part of a language that did not need words. Around her, the others moved into position, forming a loose line along the fence, their movements quiet but no longer restrained. The rhythm of the morning shifted, not faster, not slower, just steadier, as if something unnecessary had been removed and the rest had adjusted accordingly. Jack worked a short distance away, mending a section of wire that had come loose under strain. His hands moved with practiced ease, pulling, tightening, securing each piece with the kind of attention that came from years of repetition. He did not look up often. There was no need to. But every so often, his gaze would drift toward the line, not to check, not to supervise, just to see. Elise knelt beside a wooden post, the grain rough against her glove as she steadied it in place. Another woman held the wire, their coordination quiet, efficient, built on observation rather than instruction. No one told them how to do it. They figured it out. That, too, felt different. The sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows, the heat settling into the ground and rising back up through the soles of their boots. Sweat gathered at the back of her neck, tracing a line down her spine, familiar, expected, something her body recognized without resistance. She adjusted her grip, lifted the post, set it deeper into the earth, the motion fluid, uninterrupted. For a brief moment, she paused, not from exhaustion, but from awareness. Her body moved the way it was meant to. No interruption. No correction. Just movement. A guard walked the perimeter, his steps measured, his presence consistent but no longer pressing into every action. He watched, but he did not hover. The distance between observation and control had widened, just enough to be felt. Elise stood, brushing dust from her glove, and glanced down at her boots. There were no marks at her ankles now. Nothing visible. Nothing immediate. Just skin that would heal in time, as most things did when given the chance. She straightened, her shoulders settling into place, and looked along the fence line where the others worked, each movement connected, each task completed without interruption. Jack finished his section and stood, stretching his back slightly before securing the last piece of wire. He glanced toward Elise, just for a second, long enough to see that she was working, that she was steady, that nothing had been lost in the change. Then he returned to his own task, the day continuing as it always would. But the difference remained. Not loud. Not visible from a distance. Just present in every step that no longer had to be shortened. By midday, the heat had settled into everything, not sharp anymore but constant, pressing into skin, into wood, into the slow rhythm of work that no one tried to rush. The fence line stretched farther than it had seemed that morning, each post marking progress measured not in distance alone but in effort, in repetition, in the quiet coordination that had formed without instruction. Elise wiped her forehead with the back of her glove, leaving a faint line of dust across her skin, and paused just long enough to take a breath that reached deeper than it had before. Around her, the others did the same in small ways, shifting weight, adjusting posture, allowing themselves moments that had not existed earlier in the day. No one spoke about it. They did not need to. The difference lived in how they moved, how they held themselves between tasks, how they no longer seemed to brace for something that was no longer there. A truck pulled up near the edge of the field, its engine idling low, carrying water and a midday meal in metal containers that reflected the sun. The guard waved them over, his gesture simple, almost casual, as if this was any other workday, any other group of hands brought in to help. Elise walked with the others, her steps steady across the packed earth, covering the distance without hesitation. 20 yards. 30. The numbers meant nothing before. Now they did, if only because she could feel each one fully. She reached the truck and accepted a canteen, the metal warm to the touch. She drank slowly, the water cutting through the dryness, grounding her in something immediate and real. Not relief. Not comfort. Just enough. A man beside the truck handed out pieces of bread and small portions of food, his movements efficient, practiced, but without the edge that had defined earlier interactions. He met her eyes briefly this time, a second longer than before, as if acknowledging something he could not quite name but could no longer ignore. She nodded once, taking the food, stepping aside to make space for the next person. Jack stood a short distance away, leaning against the side of the truck, his hat tilted back just enough to let him see the line as it formed and dissolved. He drank from his own canteen, then capped it, his gaze moving across the group not as a supervisor, not as someone responsible for outcomes, but as someone confirming that what had been set in motion continued on its own. He caught Elisa's movement as she stepped away, her posture unchanged from the field, steady, balanced, unforced. For a brief second, their eyes met again. This time, there was no question in it. No uncertainty. Just recognition, simple and direct, passing between them without pause. Then it was gone, absorbed back into the flow of the day. The officer stood near the truck as well, his clipboard still in hand, though he no longer looked at it as often. He watched the exchange of food, the distribution of water, the way the line formed without being forced, and something in his expression shifted, not outwardly, not enough for anyone to remark on, but enough to loosen the hold of something he had relied on before. He did not comment. He did not correct. He observed. And in that observation, the structure held, but differently. Elise finished her meal and returned the empty container, her movements efficient, respectful of the unspoken order that still existed but no longer pressed down on every action. She walked back toward the fence line with the others, the ground unchanged beneath her feet, the heat no less intense, the work no less demanding. But the way she carried herself remained altered, as if a boundary that had once existed inside her had been quietly removed. She reached her place along the line, picked up the tools, and continued where she had left off, the rhythm returning, steady, uninterrupted, her steps measured not by limitation but by choice. The afternoon stretched longer than the morning, the sun lowering just enough to change the angle of the light but not its intensity, shadows lengthening across the ground in thin lines that moved slowly, almost unnoticed unless someone chose to watch them. The fence line continued to take shape, each post now standing firm, each section of wire pulled tight and secured with quiet precision. The work had found its rhythm, not forced, not rushed, just sustained. Elise adjusted her grip on the pliers, the metal warm from use, and twisted the wire into place with a steady motion that no longer required correction. Her hands remembered faster now. Her body followed without hesitation. The space between actions had disappeared, replaced by continuity that felt natural, unbroken. A breeze moved across the field for the first time that day, light and brief, carrying with it the dry scent of grass and earth. It passed quickly, but it was enough to lift the edge of the heat, enough to remind everyone that the air could move, that stillness was not permanent. Elise paused just for a second as it touched her face, then returned to her task, the moment absorbed without needing to be held. Nearby, one of the women straightened a post that leaned slightly off-center, her hands pressing firmly against the wood, adjusting it by inches until it stood aligned with the others. No one told her to do it. No one corrected her. She saw it, and she fixed it. That was how things worked now. Jack walked along the fence line, checking the work not by inspecting but by observing, his eyes moving from one section to the next, taking in the details without interrupting the flow. He stopped briefly where Elise worked, not close enough to intrude, just near enough to see the way her hands moved, the way her stance held steady, the way her steps no longer hesitated between motions. He gave a small nod, almost to himself, then continued on, his boots leaving shallow prints in the dust that faded as quickly as they were made. The guard who had handed out the keys earlier passed by again, slower this time, his posture less rigid, his attention no longer fixed on enforcing distance but on maintaining presence. He watched the line, the movement, the absence of disruption, and something in his expression settled into acceptance, as if the change no longer required explanation. The officer stood farther back now, his clipboard lowered at his side, unused. He watched the field without marking anything down, without adjusting anything, the structure of the day continuing without his intervention. For the first time, he seemed to understand that not everything required direction to function. Elise finished securing another section of wire and stepped back, measuring the alignment with a glance, her eyes tracing the line from one post to the next. It held. She lowered her hands, flexing her fingers inside the gloves, feeling the weight of the work in her muscles, the kind of fatigue that came from effort rather than restraint. It was different. It belonged to her. She turned slightly, looking down the length of the fence where the others worked, each movement connected, each action part of something that extended beyond any single moment. The chain was gone, but more than that, the need to adjust to it had disappeared as well. Her steps carried her forward without thought, covering the ground with a natural pace that no longer needed to be measured. The sun dipped lower, softening the light just enough to change the color of the dust, turning it from harsh white to a muted gold. The day was beginning to close, not abruptly, but gradually, the way all long days did in that place. Elise lifted the next post into position, set it firmly into the ground, and pressed it into alignment, her movement steady, uninterrupted, fully her own. And for the first time since arriving, nothing in her body anticipated being stopped. The last section of fence stood in place as the sun dropped lower, the light turning soft and wide across the land, stretching everything it touched into longer shapes, slower movements, quieter endings. The work eased without needing to stop, each motion naturally becoming less urgent as the day reached its limit. Elise pressed the final wire into position and held it there for a moment longer than necessary, not because it needed securing, but because she felt the completion of something that had begun before the first post was set. She released it and stepped back, her boots settling into the ground with the same steady weight they had carried all afternoon. Around her, the others did the same, tools lowering, hands resting at their sides, bodies adjusting from effort into stillness without tension. No one announced that it was done. It simply was. The guard gave a small signal, a gesture more than a command, and the group began to gather, forming a loose line again, not as tightly as before, not held in place by anything other than shared direction. Elise walked with them, her pace even, covering the distance without hesitation, the ground familiar now in a way it had not been that morning. 50 yards felt different at the end of the day. Not shorter. Just understood. Jack stood near the truck, his posture relaxed, one hand resting lightly against the side, watching as they approached. He did not count them. He did not measure them. He simply observed, the way he had all day, confirming without needing to confirm. The officer stood beside him, quieter now, his clipboard still at his side, unused, as if the need to record had faded with the need to control. He glanced once at the line, then away, allowing the moment to pass. Without shaping it. Elise reached the truck and stopped, her shoulders settling into a natural alignment, her breathing steady, her hands still. She did not look down. There was nothing there that required her attention anymore. The place where the chain had been was no longer part of how she moved through the world. It had become something else. Something finished. A canteen was passed again. Water, cooler now, carried the taste of metal and distance. She drank, slower than before, not out of need, but out of choice. The others did the same, small movements repeated without urgency, each action belonging to the moment rather than to instruction. The air shifted slightly as the temperature dropped by a few degrees, enough to ease the pressure of the day, enough to allow the land to breathe again. Jack adjusted his hat, the brim catching the last of the sunlight, and for a brief second, his eyes met Elise's once more. There was no question there now. No uncertainty. Just a quiet understanding that required nothing further. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and turned away, stepping back toward the fence line, toward the work that would continue tomorrow, toward the routine that had always existed and would continue to exist. Elise watched him for a moment, not to follow, not to hold on to anything, just to acknowledge what had passed between them without needing to define it. Then she turned back to the line, to the others, to the space that no longer felt the same as when she had first stepped into it. The sun dipped lower, touching the horizon, the sky opening into colors that spread slowly across the distance, soft and quiet, without demand. The day closed the way it had unfolded, without noise, without declaration. But something remained. Not in the ground. Not in the air. In the way she stood. In the way she walked. In the way no one had to shorten their steps anymore. And that was enough.